As students learn a second language, how can we continue to support their Language 1 development while helping them continue to learn their Language 2? Before we can think about helping students learn a new language, we need to be aware of what their native language is. A person's native language is the language they first learned. This is also referred to as their Language 1. English language learners represent one of the fastest growing populations in schools in the United States. In the 2014-2015 school year, 10% of all students were considered English language learners. This 10% represents 4.8 million students in the United States schools. This was an increase of 1 million students from the fall of 2000 to the fall of 2014. Fred Genessy explains in his articles, The Home Language and English Language Learner's Most Valuable Resource, that it has been shown in numerous national studies and surveys that, on average, ELLs underachieve in comparison to their English-speaking peers in academic domains, and that gap tends to increase the higher the grade. With this knowledge in mind, what can we, as teachers, do to help support these students in their language development? Cook explains that learning a second language involves developing that second language in a mind that already contains another language. So she suggests making connections between the two languages to help develop deeper understanding of the new language. Macaro and Lee found that many students did not want their Language 1 to be excluded from classroom interaction. Students in fully immersed Language 2 classes found that they were often left behind in instructions. As instructions were given, they were not able to understand their task, so the language that they had acquired was not able to be used effectively. When students were learning their Language 2 through a bilingual class that allowed them to use their Language 1 as part of their learning, found that their Language 1 helped them with their vocabulary understanding and their vocabulary memorization. Because they were able to use the language with which they already had skills developed in, they were able to achieve tasks and have more meaningful discussions than they otherwise would have been able to. When learning a second language through immersion rather than through a bilingual program, what impact does that second language have on the learner's native language? Cook, among other researchers, have found that when a language learner is learning a new language through immersion, that their native language can become inhibited. This disuse is presumably the reason for difficulty in quickly retrieving even common language in their native language. Levy, McVeigh, Marfel, and Anderson decided to test this theory by observing two groups of students learning a second language. One group studied in a bilingual class at their local school, and the other through immersion abroad. They also found that those fully immersed in a new language often had more difficulty in recalling words in their native tongue over time. They conclude that while disuse may be partially to blame, it appears that interference in the phonological sounds used is even more present. They explain this by stating, acquiring a new language requires learning a new word for nearly every object, a massive learning task. Fluently producing these words entails a struggle against interference from one's native tongue. Link, Kroll, and Sanderson build onto the work of the previous researchers in their same field, stating the L2 immersion experience may have reduced the functional fluency of the immersed learner's L1, thereby making the L1 appear to be inhibited when in fact it was not. While this supports the work of previous researchers, they conclude that this difficulty in accessing words in their L1 will come back as language learners return to an environment in which they will primarily use their L1 again. Allowing students to use their Language 1 in their Language 2 learning through bilingual learning opportunities helps students to maintain access to both languages. This allows them to develop multi-competency in both languages. One strategy to use in a bilingual class is to use examples of Language 2 users as proficient in their own right. Cook states that Language 2 users tend to be compared to native speakers of that language. She explains that Language 2 users have to be looked at in their own right as genuine Language 2 users rather than imitation speakers. Cook states that a practical way of doing this is by presenting language students with examples of language as used by Language 2 users rather than always the native speakers, such as examples from media sources. She also suggests reversing roles to have Language 2 learners using the new language to tell native speakers about their home countries. A second strategy to use in bilingual language instruction is to teach new words and meanings using the student's native language. This will allow the language learner to make connections to the already rich body of knowledge that they may already have. The third strategy is to allow students to use their native language to communicate with others who speak the same language during classroom activities. This not only allows meaningful conversations that students may not be ready for in the new language, but also encourages deeper connections and code switching. Fourth strategy is to encourage students to continue reading and speaking at home in their native language. Students begin learning a new language when they already have vocabulary and learning experiences in their first language. When students have rich knowledge bases from which to learn a new language, deeper connections can be made. Continuing to develop the native language can help in Language 2 development. Bilingual instruction is helpful as every activity the student carries out visibly in Language 2 also involves the invisible Language 1.